thank you for that introduction, and thank you for the invitation. It's nice to be back here. Last time I was in this room, it was directed to the other, it was oriented to the other direction. It was completely dark, no windows. Right? So it's very nice to be here again. Science that we work on describes the world. Politics governs it by crafting policies that serve the common good and benefit the public. Yet both science and policy are increasingly challenged by disinformation, as is the public. In Fairtrans, financed by Mistra and Fairtrans, we research and co-produce transdisciplinary knowledge at the interface between science, policy, and the public, aiming to deepen our understanding of the prospects for fair climate transformations. I will highlight some findings related to science, policy, and the public. Science first. Science denial is among the topics that we have studied. In the climate field, denial is quite common and take different forms. We talk about literal denial, interpretative, and implicatory. And the latter, also referred to as response denial, is quite common. It refers to situations when the reasonable response to a finding is ignored. For example, when might be important but still mitigation ineffective technologies are applauded to legitimize business as usual, which evidently impedes transformation. More concerning even than denial is when scientists are not only criticized on non-scientific, non-factual grounds, but are also harassed and sometimes even threatened. In a forthcoming study that we have done, conducted among leading climate researchers, we show that several have actually withdrawn from public engagement or even stopped completely communicating their work. In a few instances, harassments have even influenced the research itself. So we're facing what we call an antagonistic climate for climate scientists. At the same time, we have explored strategies for maneuvering in this situation. One avenue is, of course, to adjust the framing of results, another to identify and communicate scientific consensus. It's also key to explain what signifies scientific knowledge compared to just taking a position, and to highlight the many climate policy co-benefits that we can see that quite often are at higher monetary value than cost of measures, and not least to engage in trust building and constructive dialogue. Unfortunately, we can also see, having interviewed a lot of scientists, that many research institutions are ill-equipped to support scientists with these tasks, in particular in cases when scientists come under threat. While these challenges to science are clear, the policy landscape, my second point, presents its own set of obstacles and opportunities. So let's move there. After having been portrayed for many years as bad for the economy, climate policies, I would say, have since some 15, 20 years increasingly been shown to support rather than weaken economic performance, whether we talk about jobs, growth, or competitiveness of countries and businesses. In recent years, though, organized climate backlash has resulted in policy rollback in some countries, including in my own, in Sweden, which now shows actually increases of emissions of historical proportions, placing Sweden in the troika with the highest emission increases in the EU last year. When analyzing this trend in studies based on macroeconomic modeling, we see that, for instance, the weakened biofuel mandate and the radically reduced energy taxes on fuels in Sweden in the last few years result in negatives in growth, not only in terms of rapid emission rise, but also negative in terms of impact on GDP, negative in terms of impact on employment. We also see that using the same financial resources to instead support, for example, electric vehicles, provide direct payments to citizens, or lower the income tax would yield better outcomes in terms of emissions, job, and growth. Even better, again, when we speak about emissions, growth, and employment, would be to raise the carbon tax as part of a broader policy package in which revenues are recycled to households, especially those in lower income deciles. When we now in Fairtrans co-create policy proposals, science-based policy proposals, with trade unions, environmental organizations, and rural associations and indigenous people, we arrive at the same conclusion. Moreover, a recent study that also includes representatives from several business organizations strengthens these findings. We find strong support for both broad and deep climate transformation reforms based on effectiveness and fairness, including railway electrification, compensation schemes for wind energy expansion, reformed fiscal policy framework, and so on. In other words, there is, I would call it, robust scientific evidence that climate policy can be designed in ways that cut emissions and strengthen the economy, and that is understood by a majority of key players. Moving then to the public in the last 4 minutes, and their acceptance for climate policy, we also know a lot. We published a range of articles based on a large-scale national survey. Among the questions, we asked people in Sweden about reducing increasing the carbon tax on fossil fuels. And remember that the Swedish tax is among the highest in the world. About 44% opposed that. And more than half of these, 26% of the total, completely disagreed. But when we introduced a collective justice framing where the revenue from the tax would be redistributed to rural communities on the one hand and low-income households on the other, 80% of the antagonists, 26%, moved and changed their stance completely, resulting in a clear overall majority in favor of the tax increase, underlining the need for policy packages. We saw the same when we developed the first national climate assembly in Sweden, when we selected people, 60 persons, forming mini Sweden, reflecting differences in age, residence, political sympathy, climate concern, similarity. These persons collaborated, they deliberated, they met 9 times, they listened to expert input, and developed their own policy proposals and voted on them. And they were in favor of high-speed train coordination at EU level, introduction of equal aviation taxes across EU countries, a unified national public transport ticketing system in Sweden, implementation of a national reduction obligation for heavy-duty vehicles, distance-based taxes for lorries, and so on. If we finally zoom out, again, this survey shows that 77% of Swedish citizens worry about climate change and its consequences. While many in this survey acknowledge that transition to a fossil-free society may be costly, an even greater number saw it as an opportunity to create jobs. A majority moreover consider that Sweden's current climate goal for 2045 should be set at an early date. And interestingly, most respondents prioritized investments in transitioning to a fossil-free society over investments for lowering fuel prices, whereas the Swedish government is doing the opposite. I can go on for long with similar results, but to summarize, science shows a robust public mandate for more stringent policies. So the actionable science that we have produced over the years in Fairtrans clearly demonstrates strong expectations, significant economic opportunities for advancing fair, effective climate transformation policy. Thank you.